In 1989, destitute and a slave to addiction, Joe Roberts vowed that if he ever got off the street, he would do something to pay it forward.
The story begins on a park bench 5 blocks from here with one promise. 3 days before Christmas, 1989, I sat in the downtown east side in one of the poorest postal codes in Canada. I was young, I was homeless, and beside me was a shopping cart filled with cans and bottles. I'd made every possible mistake that a young person could make. In fact, that's a picture of me from that time frame. I was one of those individuals that you'd look at and wonder to yourself, how does a young person end up homeless, living in the downtown east side? To answer that question, we need to go much farther back in the story to understand. I was born and raised in Midland, Ontario, Canada. I had an older brother and a younger sister. This is me in Mrs. Morrison's class and grade 2. And I remember as a child, my life was fantastic. It was like a Disney after-school special. I was happy, I was curious. I had a tree fort and a fat little dog named Angus that had magical powers. You could hear you unwrap a cheese wrapper from 3 blocks away. Everything in my life was perfect. And then one day, life lifed me. And we got a knock on the door. Now, my father was this extraordinary man in my life. He was this hero. He was the kind of man who I would look into his eyes and I could see my possibility. And just like that, one day he was gone. A man who would say things to me like, "I love you, son. You can do and be anything." Our family went through the kind of trauma and tragedy that you'd think about in an event like that. And one of the challenges is not just losing that figure who I looked up to and I could see my possibility, but also we lost our economic well-being. Just like that, overnight, we went from a happy mom and dad, 3-kid family to a single mom struggling with poverty and uncertainty. The next man that came into our home, he wasn't anything like my father. He was a violent, abusive alcoholic. And so I went from a father who would say things like, "I love you, you can do and be anything," to a man who would say things like, "You're stupid, you're dumb, and you'll never amount to anything." At 9 years old, I had fissures in my self-esteem and self-worth, and I was struggling to fit in and find my place in the world when the opportunity to experiment and use drugs came along. And I jumped, and I joined. And for the first time when I went home, the uncertainty and the fear that surrounded myself in that home was gone, and I felt safe. And for the next 15 years, it became a familiar place for me to run to cope with the uncertainty in my life. By the time I was 15, I was angry, and I began pushing back. At 15 years old, I had a fight with that man, and I left. And at 15 years old, I was now couch surfing, fending for myself. At 16 years old, I dropped out of school. At 17 years old, I went to prison for the first time. When I was 19, I decided to leave that small community that I lived in Ontario, and I got on a Greyhound bus, and I came out here, and I got off that bus just near Georgia Street, across from the Sandman. And what happened over the next several years can be explained in watching a young man's life unravel until I was on that park bench. 3 days before Christmas, 1989, I was on that park bench, and I was beginning to descend into withdrawal. And the only way that I can describe that, it's like the flu times 100, and I needed $10. I didn't want to rob or steal or hurt anybody, but I couldn't go on feeling like I did. I didn't know where I was going to get $10 until I looked down at my feet, and I came up with my best idea. I walked into the bar across the street, and I walked out 10 minutes later having sold the boots off my feet. You know, sometimes the greatest challenges in our lives, they help prepare us for the next thing. And for the first time in my life, I finally hit rock bottom, and I became willing to do something different. In a moment of despair, I cried out for help. And I made a solemn promise on that park bench. I said, give me a second chance. If you give me a second chance, I promise I'll turn my life around and I'll do something to pay it forward. With the help of a local shelter, I got a loaner pair of shoes, and I called my mom. 3 days later, I found myself back in Ontario with the help and support of my mom. I entered into a detox facility and then a full residential treatment program, and my life began to transform. After 6 months of sobriety, I decided to go back to college. And I had these really great teachers and professors who began to work with my possibility, my potential, that for so many years was hidden from me. Finally, on that fate-filled day, 4 years later, I walked across a stage just like this. They called out my name. They said, Joe Roberts, Dean's List. I graduated with a 3.94 GPA. And I remember walking down to where my mom was. And she gave me a big hug and said, I'm proud of you, son. And on a day that I should have been celebrating, on a day that I should have been filled with gratitude and happiness, all I could think about was how many young people just like me have the same potential and the same possibility, but they don't have my mom. They don't have one person in their life to say, I believe in you and I believe in your potential and possibility. I took that opportunity in my college education. I came back out here to Vancouver. I got my first job in sales, selling copiers for Minolta. I quickly rose and found myself in a management position. And then a friend of mine said, how would you like to start a company? And I thought, what have I got to lose? I started that company with him, and together we worked really, really hard, and the years passed. One morning, I was driving my big car down through that old neighborhood. And I stopped at a stoplight. And I looked out my window, and there was a man, couldn't have been more than 18 years old, with a shopping cart filled with cans. And it hit me because in that moment, I understood the issues that create the environment for youth homelessness. Things like early childhood trauma, mental health, abuse, addiction, and family conflict in any young person's life can derail and send their trajectory of their life off in another direction. But the biggest thing it can do is hide their possibility from themselves. When I got to the office that day, sitting on my desk was a copy of Canadian Business, and I was on the cover of it as a celebrated Canadian entrepreneur. In less than 12 years, I literally went from Skid Row to CEO. I believe that there's more inside each and every one of us than we can see. Possibility. You see, I firmly believe that inside each and every one of us is something extraordinary. And all we have to do is to get up off that bench and take a few proverbial steps to discover that. I also believe that the reason we don't take those action steps is that we feel our contribution won't make a difference. But I stand before you today as that difference. You see, I am a community investment gone correct. I am the result of over 10,000 people who promised to help restore my life so that I could pay it forward. If you still have doubts or disbelief, let me remind you of where this story began. On a park bench, 5 blocks from here, with one promise. Friends, it's time to move beyond getting inspired. It's time for each and every one of us to take action. So my question to you is, what promise will you make?